Live now. Cool, everyone. Thank you so much. Welcome to round 2 of the New Zealand Schools Debating Championship. The motion for this round is, after being released from prison, this House would require people convicted of violent crimes to wear an electronic monitor bracelet for the rest of their lives. Speaking times are 7 to 8 minutes with POIs between the 1st and 7th minute. So I will clap at 1 minute. Are we all able to hear that clap? Yep. Awesome. You'll hear 1 clap at 1 minute for POIs open, another one at 7 minutes, and 2 claps at 8 minutes to wrap up your speech. We'll start the round with a round of introductions from the judges and the speakers with your names and the pronouns if you wish, though you do not have to. For example, hi everyone, my name is Juan, my pronouns are he, him. We will start off with the adjudicator.
Hello everyone, my name is Dan, my pronouns are he, him.
The affirmative team.
My name is Alex, my pronouns are he, him.
My name is Kadal, my pronouns are he, him.
Hi, I'm Leah, my pronouns are he, her.
Hi, I'm James, my pronouns are he, him.
Hi, I'm Michael, my pronouns are he, him.
Hi, I'm Yogi.
You want to check live stream tips as well?
I did check before. Awesome, thank you so much for that. Before we begin the debate, do we have any questions before we start? No, that is awesome. All right. Without further ado, I would now like to welcome up the first affirmative speaker to begin round 2.
Is that the off-center?
Four things in this debate. Firstly, on our model. Secondly, our justification. Thirdly, on effectivity. And lastly, a unique sense of safety. Firstly, onto model. What does a violent crime look like? It looks like anything from aggravated assault to things like first-degree murder and sexual assault. Onto the model. Ankle monitors track the locations of convicts, and then it notifies caseworkers or probation officers for these convicts where they are, and also alerts them when they breach the terms of their release, such as when they go to a place they're not meant to. For example, someone who has a history with assaulting or molesting children, when they go to a kindergarten, the probation officer will be alerted. This also ensures that we're able to successfully monitor convicts. What is the likely comparative there? Okay, 4 things here. Firstly, they get short-term probation. Secondly, there's some minor pathways of rehabilitation, such as helping people get jobs. And then thirdly, people are often reoffended. There's also this endangerment to the wider society. Okay, onto why this is justified. Firstly, the state has a responsibility to punish individuals who have broken their societal contract. These are the unspoken rules that societies intuitively abide by, such as not murdering or infringing upon another person's autonomy. This means if you infringe upon another civilian's rights or liberties, the state then has a right to infringe upon their civil liberties, such as taking away their freedom and sending them to jail. The state has a responsibility to protect through monitoring ex-violent criminals. We know reoffending rates are high and they're only getting higher. We need to be tracking people who we know have violent track records. Then onto scale. Even if we infringe on 300 aggressive criminals' liberties, we are protecting 3,000 potential and current victims of violent crime. In that case, we went on scale. Onto why we are more effective in preventing re-offense. Okay, a few things here. 5 things. Firstly, the bracelet is for life. This means there is no expiry date for complying with state rules and regulations. On the negating side of the house, we see ankle monitors expire, and criminals often go to restricted areas such as like their victim's house after they know they're not being tracked. Secondly, criminals risk paying a fine or going back to jail. So if the bracelet is for life, they will likely never take this risk. Why? Well, if they're poor, they're in poverty, they're not going to be able to pay this fine. But also because jail is crippling. There's like violence and there's dehumanization within jail. And thirdly, because they're going to have a worse track record than before. They don't want to take this risk. They don't want to take this risk because they don't want the track record to get worse. Thirdly, on their ability to track location. Probation officers are able to see if criminals are going to like red flag locations for a really long time. Whereas on the negating side of the house, this only happens for a short period of time. So what happens after this period once ankle monitor comes off? Well, the answer is we don't know because they're not being tracked. Fourthly, on rehabilitation. We provide systems where criminals can live better lives and break out of their like unstable mindsets. This is through things like community service and through things like therapy. On the negating side of the house, there's no rehabilitations or criminals aren't necessarily incentivized to go to. They're not required. Whereas on our side of the house, we might say, okay, you need to go to therapy on 4 o'clock on Thursdays, and if they're not there, well then the caseworker or the probation officer might do something about it. Fifthly, on incentive to not commit violent crime. This is for those who have like not been caught yet. So why is there incentive to actually not commit crime anymore? Well, the bracelet is just simply embarrassing to wear. Like, it shows you're unreliable and unsafe. If I have a bracelet on me, I'm going to probably, like, not want it there, right? But also, it shows the risk of judgment. This is through things like jobs. And it's just there forever. Whereas on the negating side of the house, we see that these criminals never get caught and or they continue to reoffend because there's no incentive to stop. On to impacts then. So, firstly, stops reoffending. It stops the reoffending of those who have already reoffended. And then secondly, it reduces the likelihood of new reoffends. But then onto rehabilitation. So at the base level, it stops crime. But above that, it's beneficial to the wife who was recently domestically abused, right? Because now she knows, okay, well, my husband who used to domestically abuse me won't be able to come back to my house because he's being tracked. But also it means if we go further than that, the criminals who are used to do really horrible things are now going to be able to get better because they're offered rehabilitation, to offer therapy, and that's required. Yes, I will also now take a peel.
Right. If you wore a bracelet reminding you of every time you badly mechanized something, how likely do you think you would be to become a better debater?
I think it's quite interesting that you are using debating as the example here. Okay, let's say I have an ankle bracelet. I think if I have that incentive to get better in my future, I think I will take that chance to get better in my future. And that sort of links to our idea of rehabilitation, right? If I have a bracelet, then we're also saying you're going to be offered ways to get better in the future. Okay, on to my fourth point on why we give the public a unique sense of safety. Okay, even if you do not buy into any of our other points, this mutually exclusive benefit still stands no matter what. Currently, the government has a responsibility to protect and ensure the safety of their people. People feel less safe when there is a criminal who committed violent crimes just out in the open. On to the next. Firstly, the public will know that they are safer. How? Well, okay, they know that criminals are being surveillance. And they also know that they have discernible ankle monitors. If they feel unsafe and they think, okay, well, I feel unsafe because there's a criminal out there, they can maybe take a look and they say, okay, well, if this person here has an ankle monitor, I'm not going to go towards them. Secondly, people females will feel more safe and more comfortable. This is especially because things like rape rates are increasing every single year and people no longer feel safe. And as mentioned, this is especially important for people like females. Using these ankle monitors means we can also track these offenders. And this is particularly important as rapists often do not receive long-term sentences, which is a reason why it is such an unsafe situation for them. Thirdly, when the justice system gives a smaller sentence, or towards the minimum sentence side, it means that it can qualm, what we're doing with the ankle monitors mean that we can qualm public outrage and also fear by offering this effective alternative. Fourthly, we also better fulfill the sense of justice for the victims also. When they see their attackers are rightfully dealt with, they're gonna feel a lot more comfortable. On to impacts. Actually, yes, I will take the POI now.
Yeah, so you say that the public is going to feel more safe. How do you think that prisoners are going to feel when they are seen for the rest of their life by the public as a prisoner or a convict?
Okay, well, we're offering them ways to get better. We're offering them things like rehabilitation. We're offering them ways to improve themselves. So I think it's really unfair for you to claim that they're going to feel horrible for the rest of their life when we're actually offering them ways to get better and improve themselves. Okay, going on to my impacts now. Firstly, women can now walk alone at night without feeling unsafe. Women right now feel unsafe because of the amount of crimes that happen, especially towards them. And when these violent criminals are constantly being watched, there's less incentive for them to break the law, and when they do, they face consequences. Women can now feel safer. They can feel like they can walk alone at night without having someone by their side constantly. Secondly, kids will no longer feel like scared or threatened by every adult they meet. Or more importantly, adults do not need to worry 24/7, right? This means that like criminals are being watched. And of course this idea of like, oh, stranger danger and don't take candy from strangers and stuff like that. But now it can be less so pushed as society is generally more safe now. Again, even if you do not buy into any of our other points, this one still stands. That is why this point particularly should be weighed heavily. Are we restricting like 300 people? Yes, but if it means a trade-off for a better society for more people, then we win on scale, we win on severity. The trade-off is necessary to protect public interest and also grow safety for the public. We have the unique benefit of safety. That is the push of our side of the house, to deter crime and also protect the people of our society who have a right to feel safe in their own homes. Stand with victims, not the criminals.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I now welcome up the first negating speaker to continue their speech.
Let's go, Jay.
SIDAF supports a world in which prisoners are never truly released. Instead, they live out a lifetime sentence in a world that will never see them as anything more than a criminal. 4 things I'll be doing for you in my speech today. Firstly, I'll be doing some important setup about the case. Secondly, some rebuttal, although most of it will be integrated. And then move on to my 2 points. The first one being how we're actually going to get increased reoffending rates and decreased reformation rates, and how there's the principal point of why we should not be doing this due to the social contract. But first of all, some important setup. How do we think the public will treat former criminals regardless of how they act once they get out? We believe generally they act with a deep mistrust, a deep fear of criminals as a whole. Why? Because you're taught at a very young age, don't talk to criminals. Criminals, once you're a criminal, you're always a criminal, especially in Western society, and you're taught this from a very young age. We also think people are inclined to speculation. When you see someone with an ankle bracelet, which doesn't tell you what crime they committed, when they committed it, you're inclined to imagine the worst possible scenario because we're risk-averse creatures, right? You're imagining that they committed it yesterday, and you're imagining that they committed first-degree murder. And what do we believe this does? It means they act differently against you, and I'll explain that more later. Secondly, what do we think the purpose of prison is? And it's going to link to the social contract. We believe primarily it's to serve justice, and it's to pay a debt to society, and also after that we believe there's the element of reformation because of that. And why do people what happens to people? Why are people reformed once they leave prison? We believe because, first of all, like in prison, you get that deterrent as to why you're not going to do something again, and you're exposed to like the worst of humanity, right? We're exposed to people that are committing crimes day to day. Often people can get attacked, can get harmed while in prison. But we also believe that it's not in everyone's nature to be a bad person and to commit crimes. A lot of these violent crimes are something like you break in the moment, you're really, really stressed out, and you butt someone at the bar. Not everyone is a premeditated murder all the time. Not everyone is predisposed to commit horrible crimes. And what do we believe currently happens when someone leaves prison? And I think this is kind of clashing with what we get from the AF side. In that currently, what we find is you get patrol officers, we get regulation around people when you leave prison, but we also find that like the claims that we get from them about rehabilitation still stand, right? You're still often mandated. So we believe it's not mutually exclusive that they get like extra rehabilitations. We get that as well. You're required to go to a therapist, you're required to go to a patrol officer almost every day. As often. And then finally, why do we believe people reoffend? We believe often like you're ostracized from society when you get these things. You can't find jobs, you can't find employment, you're outcast by society because of those reasons why people mistrust former criminals, as I explained to you earlier. And we believe like people find crime, they find familiarity in crime, and they often can come from hardship as well. Actually, finally, what is the social contract that we find? And this is also like clashing with them. We believe that the social contract is you're born with a set of rights and also obligations, and you to society as a whole. Right? The obligations like don't kill people, engage in society, and you get some rights because of that. When you break those obligations, you lose your rights. You incur debt to society that you need to repay in order to get those rights back, right? So what does justice give us? What does prison give us? It gives us a punishment. It gives you a way to pay off those debts. So at the end of the day, you get those rights back. Right? And so that's how we keep people working. That's how we keep society functioning. So now quickly onto my rebuttal. So we get this, we get all this stuff about the social contract. I'll explain that later, integrated in some integrated rebuttal. We get this thing about rehabilitation, as I explained to you. That's not mutually exclusive. We get this entire idea, this main thrust about how people are going to be more safe. I'll prove to you later why that's not going to be the case because we get more reoffending. But also we get this idea that people are going to live in safety. We don't believe this is true because we believe that if you're reminded every single day that you're standing next to a criminal on the bus or you're sitting next to them because they're wearing an ankle bracelet, you're not going to feel safe, are you? Most of the day you don't think about every single person. I don't look at Ethan and I think he's a criminal, right? I think of more as a person. I think of him more as a person. If you're reminded every single day that there are criminals around you, you're going to feel far more in fear. And also, at the very least, we believe, at the best, they help catch criminals. If you want to commit a crime, if you're really dedicated to committing the crime, we believe you are going to reoffend. You'll break the bracelet, and we believe, why we're going to be doing that later. And I'll take it for a while.
Yeah, almost all perpetuating reoffenders of violent crime underneath the current status quo reoffend due to the expiry of accountability measures, such as monitors. How does your side of the house effectively tackle this?
Well, first of all, I'll explain this a bit more later, why we actually think reoffending happens, and how I actually believe that, yes, we get reoffending on our side of the house, but it's far, far, far more worse on their side of the house, and how this is going to exponentially make this worse. So I'll get onto this now. So why do we get increased reoffending rates? When people reoffend, again, as I told you, due to this ostracization. We believe, in this point, I'm going to prove to you that AF is going to get far more reoffending rates, and you're going to get far less reform than we get under the status quo. We believe that things that happen under the status quo, such as that rehabilitation. How do we prove this? Firstly, we believe random people. People judge criminals a lot. If you see a visible reminder every single day, you're going to act differently towards them. Because of those reasons I outlined for you earlier, you're going to act differently. It could be little things, not holding the door. It's telling your kids, whispering in the air, don't talk to that guy. It's moving away. It's looking at them suspiciously. Or it's things like not talking to them. Or it's going to a suitcase and not offering something not offering something that works. What does that mean? If you're a criminal and you're seeing these things all the single time, you're a reformed criminal who no longer wants to commit a crime. What does it mean? It means you're stressed out. You're in a psychological distress. You feel you're lonely. You feel you're isolated. You don't feel you're worthy. You're judged by society. You're ostracized by it. You have difficulty making friends. You're socially isolated again. What does this mean you're going to do? It means you're going to more likely want to go back to where you were before because it's far easier to get there. If society is not accepting you, you're going back to where you were before in a community that you can have in prison, or go back to the easier things that it can be to do. So we believe more people are going to be reoffended. Second way we prove this: why do people close to you treat you differently, and why is that different to our side of the house? We believe you have a constant reminder 24/7. If you say, for example, you are in a relationship with someone, every single day in the morning when you're getting changed, you see a bracelet on you, you can't take off. And we believe that even though under our side of the house, you know that someone close to you is a criminal reoffender, you get over it, you forget it every single day. You can forget it over time. But if every single day you wake up and you realize this person is a criminal, they've done something really, really bad, I'm ashamed of what they've done, you're gonna struggle to make connections with them. You're gonna struggle to get over that compared to our side of the house. And again, we believe that leads to that ostracization, which again, as I said before, is going to lead to some of that reoffending. We also believe that there are effects on you as a criminal in yourself. If you're committing crimes every single day, often, we don't believe they're premeditated. We think you can be ashamed of them. You're reminded every single day, again, when you're getting changed, we believe you feel ashamed, you feel trauma to that. Under our side of the house, we don't have that daily reminder that you've done a bad thing in your life and you don't want to do it. You feel more worthy in your life. You're more likely to want to turn your life around, to actually seek help, to seek aid. And why is this important? Because we believe that under our side of the house, ultimately, people are going to reoffend a whole lot less than they will under the outside of the house, as I told you, leading to far more harm to society, to the public. They're going to feel a whole lot more worse about themselves because of that. And we also believe there's a principle that people are also going to be harmed because of that. Onto this quick principle point, again, as I told you, there's the social contract about paying a debt. How do we prove that we're going to satisfy the social contract and how they're violating that? First of all, the current thing is if you do a crime, you need to do the time, right? Justice operates on this principle of paying this debt. When you commit a crime, you incur that debt. Going to prison is a way of paying that debt, right? Once you leave prison, once you pay that debt, which the justice system has assigned to you, you leave, right? You no longer have to pay a debt and you get those rights back. What AF does is they mean you have to keep on losing those rights, those restrictions on privacy, those restrictions on movement, having someone following you every single day. That is a bad thing. That is encoded on your basic rights. We believe that's violating that social contract that we've established. We also believe you can't restrict thoughts or potential. Even if you think someone is going to reoffend, they've served their crime. Even if you believe they're going to do it, you can't restrict that. We don't restrict people based off the thought of doing a crime. You're restricting off their contract, off the thoughts of what they're going to do. We believe they're also doing that. They're saying there's a criminal that's done something before. They're probably going to do it again. Therefore, we need to restrict their rights. We don't believe that's justifiable. And ultimately, why is this important? Because ultimately we're taking away rights when there's no reason. And if we take away these rights, there's no obligation to keep up your societal norms. And that is why I'm proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now welcome up the second speaker of the affirmative team to continue their feedback.
When first Negating got up here and tried to justify these violent crimes by saying things like, oh, you're under stress, these things aren't meditative, trying to justify these violent things like aggravated assault, murder, and all that kind of stuff, I feel this is where they truly missed the point of what we're trying to do on our side of the house. A few things in today's debate. Firstly, I'll be responding to a lot of material brought out at first, and secondly, I'll be extending on my team's substantive portion of our case. Now, firstly, responding to the first speaker. So the first point covered a lot of material around how prisoners, we get increased reoffending on our side of the house. A few responses to this. Firstly, they talked about ostracization. We see, firstly, we see in some cases this is actually needed and necessary in society. We need to ostracize some of these kinds of offenders, like murderers, like the rapists, because oftentimes there's a low likelihood of them reintegrating successfully into society. That's why we have these own subsets that we can put them in, because we need to prioritize in this debate the wider societal impacts and the wider societal safety, because at the end of the day, those are the most important groups, the people that these people affected with their crimes. Secondly, they talked about the social, they talked about connection with people, talking about how people, when they don't have this bracelet, they are not reminded of these crimes and how this is like a constant reminder. A few responses to this. Firstly, we just see with these sorts of violent crimes, people often just don't forget. These things are ingrained into your mind. So even if you didn't have this bracelet, you still have that in your mind. You are still stuck with the notion that you did that. This bracelet only adds that extra layer of incentive, that extra layer of accountability for you as a criminal to go, damn, I just did that. To keep yourself, to keep yourself in check with the kinds of things you're doing. And secondly, we just see it makes you more accountable for your actions. Like what my first speaker brought up on that point of, being able to see, but deal with the consequences of your actions. That's a physical manifestation of what you're doing, which instills inside the minds of convicts, going, well, maybe what I'm doing isn't as beneficial, which is something they didn't get on this side of the house. Yes, there's these ideas of, prison, of like the prison system being like, they're trying to paint the prison system as this all great, all beneficial, all working thing, when it's simply not. As we stated on the outside of the house, the prison system is failing, it's understaffed, under-resourced, and often doesn't work. It only perpetuates this culture of dehumanization and negativity, which is a horrible environment to actually put these prisoners in, which means in actuality, when you give them this chance to be in society and actually be successful, but still be accountable for their crimes with this kind of bracelet, we actually give them a better chance of succeeding instead of being stuck in a broken prison system. Anyways, moving on. They also talked a lot about how, but again on this point of reoffending, we see that it's unlike a lot of these crimes that we're talking about, the way they're trying to frame these crimes are things like, robbery. They're trying to frame it in a way where it's like, reoffending is likely because, you just do this thing every day, you do this every single day and stuff like that. First, we see this is just unlikely. When you do these kinds of crimes, these are often, premeditated. You can't just murder someone out of nowhere, I can't just go kill Alex because, there's premeditation. They try and frame it like there's no motivations behind this, that you just kill people out of stretch, which is dangerous for a few reasons. Firstly, they're trying to play down the actual.
You know what?
No. They're trying to play down the severity of what these people are doing, trying to make it out like, I've just stolen a piece of paper. No, you've stolen a life. That's what you've stolen. And secondly, we just see that it's very dangerous for the mindset of society overall as a whole. When we start to downplay these things, it starts to become normalized, which is extremely dangerous in our society, because we don't want to have to normalize these things. We don't want these people to become accepted, because we don't want to be accepting of that kind of behavior to become a social norm. Before I continue with my rebuttals, I will take a POA.
Does the speaker think that everyone in prison is a cold-hearted criminal mastermind?
You see, that's not the point. See, they're trying to play it as if this bracelet applies to everyone. It doesn't apply to everyone. It's these violent criminals. They're trying to say that I'm going to arrest Saad because he stole some bread. He's going to have an ankle bracelet on for the rest of his life. No, it's violent criminals. That's the point they're missing. That's the critical contingency thingy-majiggy that is not prevalent on their side of the house. Anyways, moving on. They also talk about how we pay debt through the prison system and how that then absorbs all of, our dues. A few responses to this. Firstly, we see just a lot of the time the justice system just isn't sufficient when it comes to giving out sentences. We see a lot of the times in cases of murder, in cases of abductions, in cases of assault, a lot of the time victims often feel like they haven't been paid their dues, like these sentences are too light, because they simply are. Someone that's been murdered, someone that's taken the life of another person shouldn't be just given 20 years. They should be given life sentences. And that's something that they lack on their side of the house. They have the capacity to give those minimal sentences, whereas comparatively on our side of the house, we give them accountability for life. We make sure that these people never forget what they did. We make sure that everyone else understands the severity of what they've done to stop them from pursuing those kinds of things. No. And secondly, no amount of prison will ever fulfill no prison sentence will ever truly fulfill the justice that these victims actually need, and that's something they also neglect. They focus a lot on the point of the negating side often really focuses in on this idea of prisoners and their reintegration to society. But we see in this debate, you should really be weighing on which side actually protects the interests of wider society and the general population as a whole, because we see that as the more important actor in this debate. Yes. Before I move in to more rebuttal, I will take another POI if there is one.
How is public safety affected if you have far more people reoffending?
But we don't have far more. I just said why we have far less people reoffending. Never mind. Anyways, they also talk. They brought up this point around mistrust and how that leads to more reoffending. Three responses to this. Firstly, we see that it's just intuitive that people are going to be mistrusting of criminals on both sides of the house. But we see it's what happens with that mistrust that actually gets us that unique benefit, because now people have a better understanding of like what these people have actually done, similar to the sex offender system, you understand what that person has done, and you understand whether or not you actually want to talk to them, which is great. Anyways, moving on to this idea of the social contract that he brought up for the principal, and see, this was they really owned one of Anyways, the main push there under this point is the idea of social debt and the fact we can't restrict these people's rights. A few responses to this. Firstly, we just see at the point where someone has infringed on another person's rights and haven't paid their dues to the degree which we feel they should have, we see that they've lost that key to the social contract. They've lost their idea to these rights. Meaning, until we feel that they've fully paid it back, they cannot be accepted under the social contract and stuff like that. Now, moving on to my contribution to the substantive part of my team's case. So, as we talked about this idea of rehabilitation on our side of the house, we see it's far more effective when you have this constant monitoring of these people, because you get constant engagement with them, and that's a lot of the time what these people like. They bring up this point of ostracization on their side of the house. We see it's far more likely on their side, because people don't stay in these kinds of facilities for long, because often this probation ends, and then they lose that support from people. And B, it's because often they just don't have many friends to begin with. If you're like a premeditated murderer, you're also not going to have a really large friend group. You're not going to have a large support system. We see that when we give them these kinds of like probation, like long-term probation and long-term case managers, it means they're able to build connections and actually get avenues back into society, which is something that Team Laxin have tried to mischaracterize all throughout this debate. And secondly, it just means we get more active like improvement of these people's well-being and of these lives. So at the end of this, you need to stand for the side that stands with victims, stands with society, stand with side negating. Oh, we're affirming, sorry.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now welcome up the second speaker of the negating team to continue their team's case.
Violent crime. It's a strong word. It's a scary word. But what does it look like? As we've told you, it can look like all the way up to these murders that they rightly point out would get life sentences and so are not who we're talking about. But also, it goes all the way to people having bar fights. It goes to small decisions, small mistakes that have massive impacts on the life of many, many people, the public and the criminals, that can trap them in these cycles that creates a worse society through reoffending. All right, 3 main points for you in today's debate. The first is on criminals, and the second is on the public, and the third is quickly on the principle. Let's start with the most important one, the criminals. Note why this is the most important. This is the most important because we are proving to you why we get more criminals reoffending. This is incredibly bad for the wider society because more crimes are being done and more people are getting done over. Even if they're somehow catching them after the fact, we're having more damage done because we are increasing the reoffending. That is why criminals are the most important point in this debate. That is why the only way we protect people is by working to make sure we can reintegrate them with society effectively. And that is why this is what we are talking about first. Okay, so let's go on to this idea of reoffending. First of all, they provide to you a bunch of vague ideas of, oh, we're going to give them like a support group and then they're going to be happy. Not only is this non-exclusive, this is absolutely something we support on our side of the house, this is also something that is actively far, far worse on their side. Why? Because it is far harder to find a support group when they are constantly being reminded that you are a violent criminal. When the first person you meet, the first judgment they instantly make about you is, this guy was a violent criminal, I'm sure he killed someone, I'm sure he did something horrible, when in reality, the most likelihood is you committed a less extreme violent crime because, let's face it, most people in prison are not cold-hearted, premeditated murderers. They are people who made horrible mistakes and are paying their societal due for this, right? So we see that actually when you can't get reintegrated, when you run up against the roadblock of people everywhere, treating you like a criminal, expecting you to be a criminal, telling you that you are a criminal, that is your designated role in life, you're finding it a lot harder to, one, get back into society and find those support groups and like hobbies and people to be with that stop you from reoffending. But two, you're also finding it a lot more difficult not to think that you should be a criminal, that that is who you are, and that that is the role you should go back to. When you're reminded every day of the reality of the fact that you are a violent criminal, that's just you, that's who you are, then that is something that you are being drawn towards. That is an incentive that simply means you are more likely to re-offend, and that is the massive harm we are talking about it. They told you that ostracization is necessary because we don't want to normalize violent crime. Of course we're not normalizing violent crime. These people are going to prison. These people are serving sentences. What we are normalizing is that people can change. What we are normalizing is that we can accept people back into society, and what we are normalizing is that they should come back and be a part of society. We are letting them back into the fold. We are not normalizing that they should be kept other, that they should be kept away. When we normalize that, that is when we send criminals, we force them into desperation, and we force them into committing more crimes. So let's look at how they commit crimes. They would like you to believe that criminals commit crimes because accountability has suddenly disappeared. Not only do we still have a police system, not only are criminals in our world, in every world, monitored closely for the first 12 months with parole systems, with support, given restraining orders so they can't go back to kindergartens or their wife's house, etc., but also they are mostly not committing crimes because accountability is wrong. Criminals reoffend for one of two reasons. The first is that they are desperate. They have come back into society and it has not accepted them. They can't find a job. They can't find money. They can't succeed. And so they turn to the only thing they know, the only thing that society is telling them they are able to do. This is compounded immensely on their side of the house. When it's not simply employers, when it's not simply movies, but when it's everyone, when it's people on the street, when it's people in every house, when it's the person next to you in your apartment block, telling you that you should be a criminal, that is when that harm is compounded, that is when you are more likely to reoffend. The second reason you reoffend is because you are simply like a die-hard criminal. This doesn't change on either side of the house. Die-hard criminals are not going to say, oh, I've got a bracelet on, so I'm screwed now. They're going to either find a way around this accountability by breaking the bracelet or otherwise subverting the law, as criminals are known to do, but also they are going to act in spite of this like small thing. It's not going to stop them. It's not a massive wall. And when they told you examples like women are now happy to walk down the street at night, I don't think they care if the person mugging them has a bracelet or not. When he's holding a gun to their head, that crime is still being committed. That's still an incredible amount of danger, and that's still something that doesn't categorically happen when we have less reoffending on our side of the house, because we are normalizing reform. We are normalizing letting criminals have lives. All right. Finally, they told you that they're always stuck with the knowledge. We told you that because they're always stuck with this knowledge of them being criminal, they're more likely to reoffend. They told you that this is more of a thing that turns them away from being criminal. Not only do we see that obviously prison is still a big disincentive, there's no added disincentive to the fact that you're wearing the bracelet, but we also tell you that when we're constantly reminded of your nature as a criminal, you find it incredibly difficult to move past that. You find it incredibly difficult to move on, which is what you want to do with therapy, with support groups, to leave that person behind. Because the person who committed the crimes is not who they want to be anymore, because it is bad for them. They ended up going to prison. And the person who committed the crimes is not who we want them to be anymore. So we shouldn't constantly remind them of that person when they know very well what happened. They know very well the mistakes they made, and they simply want to move forward and become a normal member of society. All right. Oh, and finally, they gave us a very odd idea of minimal sentences and how these people are getting off easy. We actually think that things like minimal sentences are more likely on their side of the house when it's just a looser regulation, right? They're like, oh, it's okay to release this person even if he might be slightly dangerous. We'll put a bracelet on him for the rest of his life. But also we see that we've still got a justice system that's going to be handing down sentences. If you don't think the justice system is giving long enough sentences, that's a different problem. That's a different question. All right. Next, we get this idea of the public. Very quickly, because this is quite simple. They tell you that the public is going to feel safer. First of all, obviously, we tell you that the public is not going to be safer, because there is going to be a greater rate of reoffending, right? Because also they are going to be actively pushing away these criminals, and so these criminals might feel more aggressive towards the public because they are seeing them as the enemy, because they are making an us and them world. Secondly, will the public feel safer? No, because every time that woman who has that traumatic experience goes out in public, she sees these bracelets of maybe someone who got into a bar fight or robbed a dairy 20 years ago or something, and she is freaking the hell out. She is feeling like she is surrounded by the people who attacked her. She is feeling like there is no way to escape this experience. Not only are we reminding the criminals, we are reminding the victims, because everywhere they go, there will be a massive red flag that says, here is a violent criminal, here is danger, here is danger, here is danger, when there simply isn't that much danger. And if it is there, there's really nothing that they can do about it at this point, obviously. Because one, most of the time, if violent criminals are committing premeditated violent crime, it's against people they know, so they would know anyway. But also, if it's against random people, them having a bracelet doesn't matter. If they just run into a bank with a gun, the fact that they're wearing a bracelet isn't making you feel any better. So the public is not going to feel safer. They're going to feel fear at every turn. They're going to see bad things coming straight at them, and so they're going to be afraid. This means not only do they not win on their public push, they also categorically cannot win on the safety, because they have more aggressive criminals.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I'll welcome up the third speaker of the Affirmative team to wrap up your team's debate.
people who fight in bars oftentimes get let off with a warning. We think that these are not the type of people that we're talking about in this debate, because oftentimes in like bar fights, violence is inflicted upon one another. We are talking about instances where somebody's bodily autonomy has been violated, whether it's in instances of sexual assault, whether it's in instances of extremely violent assault, or in some cases murder. Those are the types of people we're talking about in this debate, and it was extremely uncharitable of them to assume that people who were getting into bar fights were ever going to be the people who reap the consequences of this motion, right? We are talking about the most severe actors, and we tell you that we, even at the expense of, like, I guess the well-being or the entire case that they're trying to push here, we want to prioritize the, like, thousands of people who have to reap the harms of, you know, sexual violence, of murder, of having their, you know, family killed by a singular person. We think that those things are really bad, and we think that that is who you should, who is more important in this debate. Okay, what am I going to talk to you about? Firstly, I'm just gonna, like, briefly go over the principle as to why this is, you know, good, why we have a justification in order to sort of impose these, like, permanent bracelets on people. Secondly, we're going to talk about why, like, sort of reoffending, right? Note that their entire case is contingent on reoffending, and yet the characterization was a bit, like, watered down as to why people reoffend, and they sort of really only gave us, like, one mechanism as to why people reoffend. I'll deal with that, and basically prove why people are unlikely to reoffend with permanent, like, monitors on them. And lastly, I'll touch on public safety, but before I get into that, I'll take a POI.
Does the speaker not believe that it is harder to reintegrate into society when reform is not normalized?
So here's the thing, right? It's like they start talking about, like, oh, reintegrating into society. We literally gave you a model that talked about community service and integrating people in society. But secondly, note that they gave us no material on how prisons reintegrate people into society either. I'll deal with that in my speech as well, but let's talk about the principle here. Note that literally at first and at second, they literally admit that there is a civil contract, but however, we think that the principle lies in the idea of debt and paying that debt, right? Like, essentially, we know that if you break the civil contract by, like, infringing upon, like, a person's bodily autonomy, the state has the ability to take, you know, that autonomy away by throwing you in prison, right? They say that prison is enough. We say that it's, like, a lot of the times murder and rape are unjustifiable metrics for, like, 3 years in prison, and we tell you that this is the reason why these, like, monitor bracelets are likely to be, like, necessary. But also note, this isn't, like, a bracelet isn't the same as prison, right? Because they wanted to try and claim that the bracelet was a sort of metric of punishment in itself, which it somewhat is, but it's not in the same way that you're literally faced with criminals, like, every single day in prison. You're dehumanized in prison. A bracelet is sort of just accountability metric to keep it in check. At the end of this principle, then, we think that we can then admit that we have a right to sort of, like, monitor these criminals if it means that we can stop them reoffending, and if it means that we can keep our people safe. Now on to reoffending, right? Okay, we look at as to why do people reoffend. Well, firstly, we get, like, a really weird characterization at first, saying that people oftentimes commit these crimes because of things like stress. That's extremely problematic, first of all. First, I want to say that's wrong, but secondly, I want to say that it's completely unjustifiable to, like, sexually assault somebody or violate somebody just because you're stressed. We think those people deserve to have those bracelets on them, right? But, like, what do we think? Why do we actually think people reoffend? We think it's something more along the lines of people with poor mental health. But note that they miss the bar of the nuance of mental health, right? Because they just say things like, oh, people get really stressed out, people get really desperate, right? But they never paint out actual examples of this, right? We see that poor mental health looks like things like you have to do out of desperation because of things like poverty. We think that it's things like lack of purpose because maybe you didn't have a father figure in your life, so you turn to, like, gangs to fulfill that satisfaction instead, right? We think that they miss the nuance of that characterization. I'm going to explain to you why our, like, model is more proximate to the, like, incentives of these actors, right? We have two things on how we can stop reoffending. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the hardline approach, and secondly, I'm going to go into rehabilitation. Firstly, on hardline approach, right? They tell us that, like, there's a really weird claim at second that people will, like, break the law, right? People will, like, break the bracelets, right? Note all of the reasons we gave you at Alex, all of the reasons that we gave in our model as to why, as the consequences of, like, fines, the consequences of being thrown back in that prison where you felt so isolated and dehumanized. If they want to claim that prisoners hate feeling ostracized from society, why would they risk being thrown back into prison? Why, if they are so poor and they have to do things out of desperation, why would they risk that $5,000 fine? We think that those incentives are enough. We tell you that, like, taking a hardline approach by tracking them, by seeing the red flag locations, by seeing, oh, are they back at their ex-wives' house that they used to abuse? We think that that is an inherent benefit in themselves, even if that happens in 5 years' time. And if in 5 years' time there's like a 1% chance of somebody reoffending and going back to their abusive wife's house, that never happens on their side of the house because you only have a 5-month like ankle bracelet on you, right? They never adequately dealt with that characterization then. I think at the end of this point, even if they say that like these people will feel ostracized by society, I think that that still means, like, as long as we get them to sort of, like, abide by the lines of, you're not going to touch somebody and hurt somebody ever again, you're not going to go to somebody's ex-wife's house ever again, we think that's a good thing in itself, right? Okay, like, let's be more charitable here. The second way that we can get people to, like, not reoffend is by rehabilitation. We literally stated in our model, we have programs like community service, we have programs like job programs and therapy that adequately deals with the mental health incentives, right? Where you understand, like, you gain understanding of why you feel inviolate within yourself, you understand your, like, behaviors growing up. But also note that these types of programs that were uncontested, by the way, sorry, third neg, too late, too little, but, like, secondly, we think that, that these are programs that directly integrate with people in society, right? They want to claim this is symmetric, right? But here's the thing, is that oftentimes these community service programs are poorly enforced. We will enforce them better on our side of the house. The last thing that they say as to why, like, people will reoffend and it'll be hard to, like, rehabilitate themselves is because, like, these people will be ostracized from society. I'm going to explain to you really clearly now why these people are already ostracized from society. Firstly, because they already off the get-go probably grew up in gangs and crimes, and that's really unusual. Secondly, because they already have track records, right? Because when you apply for a job, they literally ask you if you've ever committed a criminal offense or been put in prison, right? They never deal with that either. Thirdly, because you're likely to have nightmares about it. I'm sorry, why should you ever forget that you've raped a person? Why should you ever forget that you've inflicted violence onto a person that's directly harmed them for their entire life? We think that that's, like, not a good thing if you are able to forget that. And it's just really bad. Okay, at the end of this point then, we think that we're likely to stop reoffending due to all of the incentives we give you down the line at Alex, at Cadell, and at Abby right now. Okay, lastly then on public safety, right? We tell you that this is non-contingent. Their idea of public safety is contingent on reoffending. We tell you that the entire principle of having a system in place where you can track criminals, where you have better regulations. It's not people see the bracelet and they feel unsafe. They basically see a criminal in handcuffs, a criminal that cannot touch them anymore because they are being tracked. At the end of this point, we get more public safety, get more people we get less people reoffending, and our principle is fulfilled.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now welcome up the third speaker of the Negating.
When a man kills his best friend in a bar fight, he will live with that guilt for the rest of his life, whether he wears an anklet or not. The difference on the affirming side of the house is that everybody else who sees him in society, regardless of whether they know him, regardless of whether they understand the crime he committed, will assume the worst of him, will see him as a criminal for the rest of his life. They will not see his guilt. They will treat him like a criminal, and as a result, he will have terrible outcomes for the rest of his life, and he will never be able to feel like a part of society again. 3 things to get through in this speech. Firstly, answering some questions such as why do criminals reoffend and what kind of crimes are we talking about, and then getting into our points of clash about who is more likely to get reoffense on either side of the house, who gets a public that feels safer, and lastly, who is more likely to get better rehabilitation for these criminals. Okay, firstly, why do criminals reoffend? I think this is pretty, obvious, because reintegration is hard. When you've lived in prison for any number of years, that could be 5, that could be 10, that could be 50, you've grown used to like the prison life, the routine of it. When you move back into society and you have to become your own person again, that is difficult. It is even more difficult when everybody views you as a criminal anyway. We think that like after a certain point, you are able to begin to feel like a person again. You are able to like begin to live on your own, to like do these basic things that you weren't able to do in prison, e.g. make your own meals. We think that AF, because they stick this ankle bracelet on you, is never going to be able to achieve that level of reintegration because people are never going to be able to forget the life that they led in prison. That is why AF cannot win, because they inflate this idea that reintegration is impossible. Firstly, what kind of crimes are we talking about? We accept that when they're talking about like severe actors such as rapists, such as murderers, that they do come into play in this debate. However, we think that the vast majority of these crimes are simply violent crimes. They are crimes that involved like punching someone in the face, like maybe pulling a gun on someone while they were trying to like rob the local dairy, things like that. And a lot of these crimes occur, as they said themselves, out of desperation because they feel that they have no other chance. So how does AF propose that we fix this? They propose that we fix this by labeling them as a criminal for the rest of their lives, by telling everybody else that they must be a psychopath to commit some violent crime against another. They totally erase any chance of society to see the likelihood of these mental health issues, of this desperation that exists on our side. Okay, so let's get into some specific points. Before I do that, I will take a POI.
If our flatline approach works, does it matter if violent criminals are unable to forgive themselves?
I'll get into that later when I talk about your hardline approach. Okay, so when we ask this question, who's likely to get more reoffense, they say that it is like a must that we track people with violent track records. We say that like they tell us that ankle monitors expire and so they'll go back to these prohibited places and so like our model won't work. Okay, what do we have to say to this? We think that the vast majority of people want to reform. We think that like they provided those incentives for us when they told you that they don't want to go back to prison, that sort of thing. So what do they propose doing on their side of the house? We take away this ability to reform when they tell them that that they have no opportunity for change, that they necessarily are a criminal for the rest of their life. So when we view someone as a criminal, we believe that they are going to act like one. This is the whole idea of self-fulfilling prophecies that we have like everywhere. When you treat someone a certain way, they're going to act in that way, right? If a criminal who has like resorted to theft to like feed their family and like used a gun to do it, they're probably going to resort back to that if people are constantly expecting them to. So we eliminate that expectation on our side of the house and we tell them that they actually can reform, that it is okay. And then when they tell us that like we have to keep an eye on people, we think that we already do this indirectly with watch lists and things like that. And we are actually happy with the way that that works because it means that we are keeping an eye on these people. We are holding them accountable for their actions. Accountability does exist on our side of the house, but so does ability for reform, which they do not have. When they tell us that like we lose our incentive for rehabilitation, we basically want to say that like we don't think that these people are inherently bad. We think that people want to reform. They lose when they are unable to understand why people actually recommit crimes, and they lose when they don't understand that on our side of the house we still have consequences for like recommitting. We still have consequences for going back to old habits. They don't eliminate that on our side. Okay, and then like. They say that when we downplay crime, we normalize it. Firstly, I think that when we paint everyone as a tier 1 violent criminal, that is harmful. A, for criminals who are now unable to reintegrate when they aren't like a tier 1 criminal and they didn't commit a horrendous crime, but everybody assumes that they did. And B, for your average Joe, because they see crime everywhere now. Everywhere they look, there is someone with an ankle bracelet, and they perceive things as less safe. And this segues into who gets more safety for the public. And this is where they like get into all this stuff about victims and things like that. But firstly, just talking about the general public, they claim that the public is going to know that they're safer, and they claim that they have this protection for victims. We think that it's actually worse for victims on their side of the house because they have a constant reminder of like the availability, for lack of a better word, of criminals. They are constantly seeing criminals everywhere, and when a woman who has been raped goes outside to like buy her groceries and sees in the grocery store several men with ankle bracelets on, she is going to be scared. She is going to be taken back to all the terrible things that happened to her. This is something that they haven't been able to address because it's impossible to address. This is just something that is going to happen. And we think that this means that victims are never able to move on. When they tell us that victims need criminals to have a life sentence in order to move on, we think that victims need help, they need therapy, they need a support network, and that is not what this debate is about. What this debate is the support network that we provide to criminals to stop them from reoffending. So when they tell us that the public knows that they're safer, when we talk about the average public, kind of the same mechanisms apply in that whenever they see people out, like when they're doing their things that involve their daily lives, I don't know, dropping James off to soccer practice, they see these criminals and they are like inherently afraid because they see them as someone who could cause harm to them. This is a harm that they cannot address on their side of the house, and so they lose their biggest point on safety for the public. And then getting into rehabilitation, they claim that their option for therapy went uncontested. It went uncontested because it's completely unexclusive. This option exists on both sides of the house. So why is it different? We provide more support when we tell people that they can become part of society again, that they don't have to be a criminal forever. This is something that they don't do on their side of the house. When they claim that they will enforce therapy better or something like that, that's just like inherently untrue. We think that we are like more likely to provide these options for therapy when we see that it's going to be more effective because more people see the ability in themselves to reform. That is why we win this point. That is why they absolutely cannot win this debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and as per tradition, we will now reverse the orders, and I now welcome up the leaders reply from the negating team to close off their speech.
I think there are two ways in which we can win this debate. One of these ways in which we prove to you that we get far worse impacts for the public as a whole. The AF team have come with this really big push about how we should care about the public the most. The second way, and which I'll explain to you why we believe this is a way we can win this debate, is we prove that there were really, really bad impacts on individuals and on criminals, and therefore onto like the social contract. So those kind of fall into two primary points of class in the debate. First of all, like what do these criminals look like, and I'll talk about like reoffense and rehabilitation in this point, and then what are the impacts on the public. But first, I think it's really important we like address this characterization about who we are talking about when we're talking about violent crimes in this debate. Michael told you that, like, really pointed out that the most severe crimes are like things like first-degree murder already get the harshest sentences. They already get life in prison. They've come back and said that, like, throughout this case, that criminals aren't getting the sentences they deserve, but we haven't heard any substantial mechanization as to why this is the case under our side of that, in the status quo, right? So we have no reason to believe that. But we also believe, as Lydia told you, this debate is about also like those petty crimes. Even if you do believe that like the violent criminals aren't getting like the life sentences that they deserve, it's about like people that punch their friends in bars. It's like people that are acting out of desperation. Those are who we're talking about in this debate. So how do these fall into these two primary points of class? So first of all, what do these criminals look like? And this is how we like get to like what happens with reoffense and what happens with rehabilitation. So what happens with reoffense? We get this really big push from the outside of the house about how we have deterrence, how these bracelets were acted as deterrents with fines and poverty and fines. And we don't believe this is going to be the case. Because fundamentally, we believe, like as we've told you, these are actually acting in the opposite way. We believe these are ostracizing people from society. We believe that Like it's a visible reminder every single day, knocking out the material that they give us that people already know these things. No, you like if you're a random person in the public, you don't look at someone and immediately know if they're a criminal or not. If you have these ankle bracelets on you, you do know that immediately. That is literally the first impression you get of a person. That you have this, you're ostracizing from society. As I told you at first, people act differently, they treat you differently, and we've told you these outcomes throughout the case. And as Lydia told you, we also believe that if you are told you're a criminal, if you're constantly reminded you're a criminal, you have like a criminal nature in you, you're going to act this way. That is why we think we're going to get far more reoffence under their side of the house. We get this point about rehabilitation, and they give us this idea that like somehow rehabilitation is only exclusive to the outside of the house. The ankle bracelet is not a therapist in your ear. It is something that's like it is symmetrical on the our side of the house. It can coexist. We can give you therapy. In fact, we do give therapy under the status quo. And we know if you're not going, because the therapist will tell you that like these guys aren't showing up for therapy. So we believe that like rehabilitation is symmetrical. We get it on both sides of the house. Why is this important? We believe that like fundamentally, first of all, if we get more reoffence, we get more crimes. That's bad for the public. Secondly, if criminals repay their debt in prison, as I told you, like we believe they are currently. They haven't given mechanization as to why that's not the case, and they still are losing the rights after they pay the debt in violation of the social contract. We believe that's a really bad thing. Why? Because when the social contract is violated from one of the parties, there's no reason for anyone else to continue their social obligations to society. That is where the system falls apart. The social contract is important in that way because it keeps people doing what they need to do. And so that's a really bad harm that we see. And also believe there's no reason to keep them down if they've paid their debt. What are the impacts on the public? This is also really important. We get this idea about like victims' feelings. We don't believe that victims' feelings. We believe, again, murderers already get like a life sentence. We get this idea that people feel safer. As Lydia and Michael really eloquently told you, if you see the bracelet every day, you're reminded every single day about the trauma that has happened to you. You don't feel safe, and you think you're in fact surrounded by criminals. You're not going to the supermarket if you're a woman who's been raped. If you see the people with ankle bracelets, and immediately assume every single man around you that has an ankle bracelet can harm you. And we also give you like these crimes are still going to be committed fundamentally. They're just going to be able to catch them more. And again, more reoffence gives you more crime. If you care for the public in this case, that's one way we win. If you care about the social contract, and you care about the criminals, and the things that hold society up, that is another way we win. And ultimately, that is why I'm proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I now welcome up the final speaker for the debate, the affirmative team's speech.
Negating got up here and spent a combined 28 minutes arguing about ostracization within society and whatnot. I do not think this is to the extent that they attempt to claim. But even if we buy into this, we still see that their case doesn't hold up. So let's take a look at their best case scenario for their world. In this world, there are still many issues, and here are the two main issues. Firstly, there is still an incentive to reoffend. The most important thing here is that the negating side of the house has no way of stopping victims from reoffending. There is no effective alternative provided that is able to mitigate reoffense of crime. And secondly, people will feel unsafe. Nothing is being done on their side of the house that actually makes people feel safer or make people safer. Nothing is done to make women feel safe, alone at night. Nothing is done to make victims of domestic violence feel safe in their own homes. This is so important, and this needs to be weighed heavily. This is an issue, and we can all agree that this is an issue, but the negating does not combat this. Negating is also up here arguing about how, like, someone who got into a bar fight will be affected by the motion. As Manukau has said, it is extremely uncharitable for them to claim this. As early as first, we define what violent crimes are, and it's really uncharitable for them to come up here and claim that it's these people who are in bar fights, right? The case here does not hold up because that is not what we're talking about. And even if someone got into a bar fight and they killed their best friend, that is still murder in the eyes of the law. Now let's flip this and look at the world on our side of the house. Three main things here. Firstly, we prevent people from reoffending. Secondly, we make people feel safer in their own homes. And thirdly, we allow these criminals to integrate into society and get them to benefit society, such as through community service. So now let's weigh up both sides of the house. Neg's biggest push here is on reintegration and reformation. We want that too. It is not mutually exclusive in this case, it is symmetric. But the difference here is we have far greater mechanization all throughout our case. On top of that, we have the mutually unique benefit of increased public safety. Neg cannot claim this because we have heard no mechanization from how their world is safer. And on rehabilitation, we get better engagement through mandated rehabilitation. It is unfair for Neg to come up here and claim that criminals will be ostracized on our side of the house in these rehab facilities. But that's just not true. When they see people who have gone through what they have, they will realize that they're not alone and see these alternative pathways. If we stop re-offending, even if it has some harms to criminals, the welfare and safety of the general public and also those past victims of rape, of domestic abuse is more important to the average reasonable voter. That is what is important in this debate. On top of the engagement on our side of the house, we also have longevity. We have longevity through the bracelets, which Neg does not have. They are going to be there forever, and they come up here, they cannot force longevity on rehabilitation. It just comes naturally for us. At the end, when we weigh up these outcomes, it is clear which side wins. We win on scale. 30,000 public civilians protected compared to 3,000 criminals. We win on severity, having a deep, severe impact on criminals through rehabilitation and also through public safety. And then we win on longevity through our long-term methods compared to negating short-term methods of mitigation. I reiterate, stand with victims, not the criminals. Propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I thank both teams for an awesome debate. I ask both teams to cross the floor and shake each other's hands, and may I ask everyone to go away outside while the judge. Thank you.